Welcome back to The Loop, your weekly dose of all things property management. I'm your host, Collin Stewart, and each week we're going to dive into the latest trends, strategies, and stories shaping the property management world. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, we're here to provide insights, expert interviews, and practical tips to help you navigate the ever-evolving landscape of property management. In today's episode, we're celebrating a pretty remarkable milestone, 75 years of solo real estate. Not real estate by yourself, solo, the name, real estate. I'm joined by Alejandro Franqui and Deborah Solo to explore how 3 generations built a boutique property management company that's stayed true to its values while Philadelphia transformed around it. Alejandro, Deborah, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you and glad to get a chance to celebrate 75 years with you.
Thanks for having us.
We're happy to be here.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to go blow by blow, year by year, month by month, but help us understand the origin story. Your grandfather started this in 1951?
And my grandfather did, and actually my mother's grandfather was a property investor before that. My family has been in Philadelphia since probably the late 19th century, and they had a department store in downtown Philadelphia. That was the family business before. So we've had family businesses sort of for many generations. When my grandfather, my great grandfather, was successful in that business and started investing in properties, buying rental properties around the city. And when my grandfather came back from World War II, he served in the military. He was going to go into the family business of the department store. He moved to Reading, Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half from Philadelphia temporarily to run the factory there because they made all their own clothes, department store. And really, that was not the business for him. But as I said, my great-grandfather had been investing in real estate. And so my grandfather started to sort of was interested in that and started helping his father with buildings that his father owned, and then became a real estate broker and started a business of buying and selling real estate, helping people do that, and property management, which really grew up in earnest starting in 1951, which was the year before my mother was born. So now she remembers everything since then. She can.
Yeah, I remember since, from 52 on.
Yeah. So 1951, the business started, and we've been going really in the same neighborhood, a couple of different locations within the same neighborhood, within a few blocks of each other for the last 75 years.
Yeah.
Incredible. And Deborah, at what point did you get involved in the business?
Well, I have early memories of going with my father to open houses, properties he had for sale, because my mother said, "You never spend any time with the children." So he took me, it's interesting though, because I'll sometimes go into a house and have true deja vu. Like I was 6 years old and I was in this house. But my real activity in the business was in the mid 80s. I got my real estate license. I actually came into the business to help my father because he had a sort of a management crisis. And I kind of did everything from bookkeeping to, well, I didn't fix toilets, but, I did sort of a full range of things. And then, I got more and more active as he got older and took over the business, I guess, sometime in the 90s.
And I'd love to kind of explore how each generation kind of changed the business while kind of staying true to the core values. And so what did it look like? What did the company look like in 1951 and how did that evolve?
Yeah, well, it's, again, our memories, we don't have any actual memories of 1951, but my father, he was active in sort of some of the restoration of Philadelphia. So Center City was not kind of a great place then. People had fled the city. There was a lot of shells and properties that had gone into, they were decrepit. There was a big food distribution center in what became Society Hill. And so he got pretty involved with different architects around in the city to get into redevelopment. But when I got involved in the 90s, or I guess mid 80s, interest rates were incredibly high. So people weren't coming into the city, and there was a lot more of purchase money mortgages in terms of sales. But I guess at that point, my father was able to transition to managing more properties. So first he managed maybe for his father and himself, but then he managed for other clients. So I guess there was kind of an even sales and then management. And they were, they were selling to investors and they were then managing their properties. So I think that's under his tenure, that was sort of what was happening. Under, my tenure, I was learning a lot from him, or just by watching, I guess. And there was more, politically, things were going better in Philadelphia. So there was more interest in people coming into the city, living in the city. And so, the business just grew, I think, in that way. I think one big difference, though, is that I became more committed to working with clients who were interested in improving their properties, not just buying and holding on to them. So I think that was kind of a difference between my father's approach and mine.
You shared in the pre-interview a funny anecdote.
Alejandro had that story.
Well, that was the thing with my grandfather was, he was a really nice man and he loved helping people out, but his position was always, yeah, your heat's not working, I'll reduce the rent. You go buy a space heater. Like that's the best solution in this situation. Like we all win here. And that was more his attitude was, oh, that's not really broken. That you just have to do that and then it'll be fine. So I think that an interesting side aspect of our story. So it's like my mother was talking about when she was a kid, going to open houses with her father. I remember the exact same thing, doing that with you when I was, because my father also was in the business, as he was a real estate attorney. So they were both kind of involved. And so I was at the office growing up, 5 days a week, and then on weekends at open houses and stuff like that. So I kind of also learned it that way. We grew up, my sister and I, and my parents raised us in a neighborhood that had seen a lot of decline, that was an industrial part of the city. And so sort of an urban renewal, lots of things had been cleared out, but there were a lot of old buildings that were beautiful Victorian era houses that had fallen apart. And so my mom went to architecture school in the 70s at the University of Pennsylvania. And then she bought a couple of, my father and my mother bought some properties in this neighborhood, Northern Liberties, that was sort of 5 years away from being 10 years away from being a place that would gentrify, and renovated places. We grew up in a beautiful house in Northern Liberties. And, that architecture background, I think, led to she was talking about how my grandfather was interested in revitalizing the city in his way. And so my mother also had that interest. So, that was sort of a very cool way to grow up, I think. People were rediscovering that part of the city. Had a lot of friends whose parents were skeptical of that neighborhood, but then now all of their kids live in it, 20, 30 years later. So, and that's partly because they saw it as I was growing up and they visited and things like that. So that really led me to be interested in the city. And after I left Philadelphia for a while, because I thought, I knew it too well almost, needed something different. I came back to it in my late 20s and went to school for city planning, also at the University of Pennsylvania. So a similar but different to the architecture background. And, to sort of understand the history of the city and why it expanded to the point where it was over 2 million people by 1960, and then contracted to the point where it was about 1.4 million people by 1990, and then has now kind of resurged over the last 30, 40 years to be where it is now at about 1.6 million people. So there's all of these neighborhoods that have seen the revitalization and more to come. Philadelphia still has, it's not quite in the Rust Belt, but it's a sort of a formerly industrial place that still has a lot of area for expansion, re-expansion, or sort of filling in parts of the city that saw a lot decline.
Love that.
A business that contributes to the community.
And I want to talk about contributing to the community, but I feel like while we're here, seeing as we're talking about the place where you are, tell me about the building that you're in, and when was it originally purchased?
So my grandfather, and I've tried to actually get an actual date, but my grandfather and grandmother purchased this building probably late 40s, early 50s. And my grandfather was a great one for modernization, which at that time meant, plywood and sort of what we wouldn't really consider maybe the best things now. But so, yeah, he purchased that along with some other pretty sizable and significant, real estate in Center City, Philadelphia. He was
historic.
Historic Center City.
I think we found out at this point that the building was originally built in 1878 or
Yeah,
really
I would
around
say
that.
it's post Civil War.
Post Civil War, but like just a few years within
Yeah.
a year or so after the Civil War.
But it was added to, so I'm sure it was the house of a wealthy person, and there was a stable in the back. The stable was probably taken down in the early 1900s, and a 4-story kind of almost like a small warehouse was added to this building.
Yeah, I mean, behind me is an original wall from that warehouse building. So it was just a sort of a brick addition that built out on the entire lot. And it goes street to street. It's probably 200 feet deep.
Yeah, it's probably a little more. But so the front part of the building feels very Victorian, or looks very Victorian. It's brownstone, which is an unfortunate material that they used, which falls apart, and it's very costly to restore. And then the real rear portion of it, which was a stable, at least believe it was a stable because it fronts a small street where there were a lot of carriage houses, became this little warehouse. So it's kind of a cool combination of stuff.
Yeah, there's a carriage house directly across the street, if you could see it, that was probably built by Frank Furness, who was a very famous Philadelphia architect and had large commissions. There's a building next to it with a placard that says 1881. So there was this row of, they would store their carriages just across this little street, which was cobblestone until probably 2000. And so this part of the building that I'm sitting in was a big field with stables and horses and a garden. And then across the way was like their garage where they would have their carriages and stuff like that. So the carriage houses have now all been restored, and they're beautiful houses for people. There's a sort of I think in a similar way to New York, Philadelphia has this very interesting housing stock that was built over the course of now almost 400 years, 350 years. And so it kind of intertwines, and it doesn't necessarily have a uniformity, but block to block, you walk down the street and you'll see a building built in 1860 next to a building built in 1950 next to a building built in 2010. And some people criticize the architecture as not having a consistency, but I think it just is sort of a fascinating study when you walk around the city to kind of see the different times when there has been when Philadelphia has had things going on. Basically,
I love that you're still in the building that your great grandfather built. I love the story of how it's evolved. I want to close with talk to me about the Passive House project, because it kind of ties the whole thing together. We started 75 years ago. The business has evolved. There's been so many different versions of it, and this is kind of a project that seems like the embodiment of your values of how you feel like the property management world fits into the community. So talk to me about the Passive House project.
Yeah. So we've done a little bit of development projects. I mean, my mother, we talked about how we did some redevelopment stuff, especially younger in my younger days when my mother and father were doing that. Then I went to school for city planning, and I wanted to do some scale development, urban infill, obviously, like Philadelphia development. We bought a property in 2014 that was a couple of lots and an old warehouse, and we redeveloped that. And there was an existing Victorian house, probably built maybe even before the Civil War. There was one house, warehouse, and a bunch of lots. We redeveloped that with an architect who was living in the same neighborhood as the property. And he was at that time saying, we built it into condos, 14 units, and we still own that warehouse. We rented to a film production company. As we were making that project, the architect we were working with said, have you heard about Passive House? And we hadn't. And he was trying to convince us to do that in that property. And we thought that was maybe a risk because it's more expensive to build. We weren't sure if people had an appetite for it enough to sell 14 apartments. But we adopted some of the things he was talking about, trying to improve our insulation, make sure we picked high quality windows, didn't do all the systems and things like that. But we had a really good, but people really did appreciate the things that we did do to make that property more sustainable, more efficient. And we realized that we might have an opportunity as more people were coming to the neighborhood, that there would be people that really cared about this as well.
Alejandro, Deborah, thank you again for coming on and sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Collin. It's really great.
Thanks a lot, Collin.
You're welcome. And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll catch you all next time.